teachers, parents, and students. Welcome to the ISF Academy Chinese Research Center Dunhuang Lecture Series. I'm Alex Zheng, your MC for the lecture. We are delighted to have you all here today, as well as the online audience to join this afternoon lecture. Before we start, please turn your mobile phone to silence mode, as we want to provide an uninterrupted experience for everyone. Also, please note that there will be a Q&A section following the lecture, where you will have the opportunity to seek clarification or share your thoughts with our speaker. To begin, let me introduce the director of the Chinese Research Center, Dr. Bill Mack, to give us an opening remark. Dr. Bill Mack.
Thank you, Alex. Good afternoon. So it's my great honor to introduce you Professor Richard VanNess Simmons. He's professor in the School of Chinese at the University of Hong Kong, specializing in the history of Chinese dialects and Mandarin. He has done fieldwork mapping dialects in Jiangsu and Zhejiang, and he recently published studies in Colloquial Chinese and its history, Dialect and Text, published by HKU Press, 2022. So please have a round of applause to welcome Professor Simmons.
Thank you, Dr. Mack, for the nice introduction. And I'm very honored as well to be here and thank ISF for the invitation and Dr. Mack for setting it all up and all the arrangements. So I have a lot to say, so I think I'll just get started with the talk. And what I want to talk about, as it says here, is the history of Mandarins or Mandarin's past. Some highlights of research and work that I've been doing over the past several years. And I also teach some related material at the University of Hong Kong. So I'm sharing with you a whole sort of selection, highlights of what I've been doing over the past few years. So let's start with the words Mandarin and Guanhua. In the Ming, a new assortment of words for divergent linguistic registers and dialect varieties arose. Local dialects came to be known as Xiangtan, village talk, and the lingua franca got the prestigious label Guanhua, language of the officials. Probably beginning in the Ming sometimes, the word Mandarin showed up in Western parlance. Okay. So the word Mandarin, now the popular way to refer to modern Standard Chinese in the English-speaking world, started out one half of a calc-like translation of the Chinese word Guanhua, the language of the officials. The etymology of the word Mandarin is comprehensively documented in the OED. The Guan officials were, of course, the civil and military officials of the imperial government and the Ming and Qing. Beginning in the early 16th century, these officials came to be called Mandarins by the Portuguese, using a word they had picked up during their mercantile sojourns in Asia. And ultimately, that derives from Malay, Mentri, and or Sanskrit mantri, which was a term for counselor or minister. Adding in the meaning of the second syllable of the word, hua, spoken language, Guanhua thus came to be rendered in Western languages, for example, as la lengua mandarina in Spanish, and that means the language of the Mandarins. Thus, the language of the Mandarins in English was later simply the Mandarin language. This is from a 17th century dictionary of Guanhua that was compiled by Francesco Varro. So in English, we have, it came to be known by the 19th century as simply the Mandarin language, which is how it appears here in what is called the Hobson-Jobson, a delightful 19th century dictionary of Anglo-Indian English compiled by Sir Henry Yule and Arthur Cook Burnell. The Hobson-Jobson entry tells us that this refers to the language spoken by the official and literary class in China as opposed to the dialects, and thus it's different from the written language. The earliest known appearance of the word guanhua in its Chinese language form is found in the annual records of the Joseon dynasty of Korea, recorded from 1413 to 1865. A passage from the 9th month of 1483 in the Rizhou Silok, the true record of the Yi dynasty, notes that I have to go back. It notes, as we have cited here, that Chief Gegui looked at the book. They were looking at interpretation of the Xiaoxue and said this translation is quite good, but there are archaicisms in it. He's referring to classical Chinese, which are not in line with current practice and moreover are not guanhua, so no one listening can understand. We can see then that guanhua was clearly understood to be a spoken language. The earliest passage in a text written in China that has the word guanhua also emphasizes that it referred to a spoken language. So, He Liangjun, in his Si You Zhai Cong Shu, Discussions from the Four Friends Studio, which was written or completed in 1569, remarks about a Ming poet and calligrapher of some repute who refused to speak his local dialect. It says that Ya Yi, who is Wang Chong of Suzhou Yayi Shanren, did not like to employ his hometown language, and when speaking, he always used guanhua. There's an entry on Wang Chong in the Dictionary of Ming Biography. It has a note by the editor, L. Carrington Goodrich, who was actually born in Tongzhou near Beijing and was thus a native speaker of the dialect there. Commenting on this passage, he says that He Liangjun's reference to guanhua apparently meant the Peking dialect, which most Southerners aspiring to high office in the imperial court learned as a necessary accomplishment. However, I can tell you that Goodrich probably did not know that the Beijing dialect he spoke was different from the dialect of the city in the Ming. The idea that scholars would learn guanhua is also borne out by this remark by Xie Bang in his Siming Shu Hua. He says, if a Xiucai scholar speaks to friends in his ordinary dialect, that is, outside of his hometown, it's not understandable. So, when one attains first place in the imperial examination, that would probably be, he used the word jiake, but it would be jinshi, and learns how to speak guanhua, one holds one's head high and never goes back to the way it was at home, speaking the local dialect. So it seems that Wang Chong, who only attained Xiucai and never got a higher degree, was still trying to compensate for his failings by insisting on speaking guanhua. However, the nature of guanhua and its connection to the language of the imperial court was not a straightforward one-to-one relationship, and in the Ming, it was by no means simply a term for the Beijing dialect. The complexity of the situation is hinted at in an observation by Zhang Wei in his Wen Qiji, dated 1590. In a passage titled 各地乡音, he's explaining different regional pronunciations, focused on the pronunciations of this guanhua. In general, the ru tone, he says, is pronounced as a ping tone north of the Yangtze, and there are also many pronunciations that have no corresponding Chinese character, which cannot be fully listed here in his listing. It's interesting that he says south of the Yangtze, the dental sounds frequently suffer from muddled pronunciation, But he says these are merely regional accents within Guanhua. So Guanhua could have regional accents, even if it's a spoken lingua franca. So he says if the various local dialects are used, it is even more difficult to communicate. So this is the language scene in China that Matteo Ricci observed and experienced during his travels and work in China in the late 15th century, it should be the late 16th century, in his journal, which was compiled in Latin and published by Nicholas Trigal. Ricci provided a basic account of the nature of Guanhua, which he romanized slightly different, spelling it with a Q, and the widespread utility of this language within China's larger linguistic environment. He notes that there is a spoken language common to the whole empire, known as Guanhua, an official language for civil and forensic use. This is sort of quasi-official because the government never said you need to use it. They just that all the officials did. But this was Matteo Ricci's understanding. The national tongue probably resulted from the fact that all the magistrates, as we shall explain later in his journal, are strangers in the provinces in which they govern, and to avoid the necessity of obliging them to learn the dialects of the provinces, a common speech was introduced, he says. It sort of just arose naturally for transacting official government business. He says this dialect is now in vogue among the cultured classes and is used between strangers and the inhabitants of the province they may visit. With the knowledge of this common language, there really is no necessity for the members of our society, that is the Jesuits, to learn the dialects of the provinces in which they work. A province dialect would not be used in polite society. What he means by that are educated people. Although the more cultured classes might use it in their home province as a sign of neighborliness, or perhaps from a sense of patriotism outside. But this national official tongue is so commonly used, he says, that even women and children can understand it. Now, it probably isn't the case that it was understood by everyone, but women and children in upper classes probably were exposed enough to it that they could understand it. So it's quite interesting that this situation had developed. Ricci had been writing from the perspective of a deep personal experience with the language. Before I go to that, the 18th century historian Du Halde, who was French, who wrote about Chinese history and culture based on interviews he had done with a large number of missionaries who had returned from China, wrote a history in French, and this was later translated into English, and he described the situation very accurately, saying, "The Mandarin language is properly that which was formerly spoken at the court in the province of Jiangnan," which would be referring to Nanjing, "and spread into the other provinces among the polite people," that would be the educated. Ricci had been writing from the perspective of a deep personal experience with the language in the previous slide. He first arrived in Macau in 1582 and began his study of Guanhua and written Chinese there. Yes, it was quite possible to learn Guanhua in Macau in the 16th century, and even in Guangzhou and Guangdong in the Ming and the Qing. The following year, Ricci was able to go into Guangdong and China proper, where he traveled and worked in a variety of cities, large and small, using Guanhua to communicate wherever he went. He basically did not learn a local dialect. In the late 1590s, he spent time in Nanjing, Nanchang, and then in Nanjing, and eventually he traveled to Beijing in 1600. On the way to Beijing, his journal records an anecdote about an experience that took place during a stopover in Linqing, Shandong, that points to a dialect to emulate in learning Guanhua. He says the eunuch who had been in charge of the expedition logistics, sailed away joyfully. He had to leave them at that point. And as a present to the fathers, he left them a boy whom he had bought at Nanjing. He said he was giving them this boy because he spoke so distinctly, and he could teach Father Didako the purity of the Nanjingese tongue. So in fact, the Guanhua that Ritchie learned and spoke must have been a commonly accepted southern variety of Mandarin, maybe even specifically the dialect of Nanjing and its vicinities, as a scholar, Paul Fumianyang, had found in a 1986 study of the nature of Ritchie's Mandarin. Yang added that although Matteo Ricci spent about 10 years in Peking, documents show that he never replaced his southern Mandarin speech with a local Peking dialect. How could that be? Well, actually, the Peking dialect of the late Ming was probably markedly different from the city's dialect in the late Qing. In fact, it was almost certainly an only slightly evolved descendant of the language of Nanjing, which had been the Ming Dynasty's first capital, when the Yongle Emperor Zhu Di moved the Ming capital to Beijing in 1421. At that time, Beijing was a brand new city, rebuilt entirely to be the capital. Yongle had built it upon the largely demolished framework of the Yuan capital, Dadu, and the imperial court and its huge entourage, including probably a vast number of civil and military officials, moving north from Nanjing and the surrounding Jiangnan region, settled into an entirely new residence. The walled city of Beijing was effectively a Jiangnan dialect island in the Beizhili region, and hence its language was probably quite similar to the spoken Guanhua that Ritchie had mastered. This is a conclusion that I've come to. You won't necessarily see this said anywhere else, but I have determined that must have been the case. This situation must have persisted through the end of the Ming, for after the Manchus and their interpreters and translators had taken over Beijing and founded the Qing, they seem to have discovered that the Hebei dialect that they had been using to communicate with the Chinese across the border from their homeland territories in the northeast did not have the upper hand in Beijing. Instead, a southern Jiangnan dialect-colored form predominated among the bureaucratic class that they encountered in the city. Only later, over the course of the Qing, did a more local Hebei dialect-like variety slowly gain prestige within the city and become the primary language of the Manchu ruling class, because at that point, the ruling class had lost it, it no longer had roots in the Jiangnan region. And with that, a northern form of Guanhua also began to gain influence and currency. A colorful picture of the late Qing linguistic environment is provided by Gao Jingting in his Zhengyin Cuoyao, published in the early 19th century. This counts as the first indigenous textbook of Guanhua, sort of the first Putonghua Keban. In introducing the study of Guanhua, Gao notes that one must carefully distinguish between northern and southern versions of Mandarin. This is by the early 19th century. His text also has a vivid description of the utility of Guanhua for interregional communication. I've got it here, I've quoted his whole passage here because it's quite interesting. He notes that there are local colloquials everywhere and dialects everywhere, but the various speakers of the various dialects do not understand each other if they come from a different locale. And it's the situation throughout China, not just in Fujian and Guangdong, he notes. And he says, I have traveled in Jiangnan, Zhejiang, Henan, Hubei, and Hunan. And the local language and regional patois is different in each place. He says, but only when traveling on the canals and at the wharves the people of these businesses who engage in commerce all know how to speak Guanhua. So it's not just the officials. He goes on to say, when you go to the capital, it's even more amazing, he says, stranger, 奇怪. It means amazing. There are great numbers of people in the capital in Beijing, strolling in the avenues in groups of 3 or 5, speaking their own local dialects, depending on where they came from and who they're with, in a great cacophony. One has no idea what they are saying. But when they enter the shops to make purchases, they are fully conversant in Guanhua, of which northern and southern vernaculars can both be heard, all spoken quite clearly. And when asked when they are from, they say they're from various places outside the city, different provinces and villages. So his conclusion is that not one of those who wish to journey forth in search of fame and fortune does not learn Guanhua. If you leave your hometown, you must learn Guanhua. It is not possible to get around without doing so. So that's quite fascinating. And also, you can sort of almost imagine now travelers moving north and south. Gao Jingting was from Guangzhou, and he traveled north all the way to Beijing and learned Guanhua on the way. He was 13 when he did that. And he witnessed this rich linguistic tapestry along all the routes that he traveled. So, looking back in time, what language had predominated in the city of Beijing, or the Beijing area? That would be the capital of the Yuan dynasty, Dadu. What language had predominated? Well, the generally accepted answer to that question is that it was the language represented in this book called Zhongyuan Yinyun by Zhou Deqing. This is the earliest sort of dictionary, a sort of book to realistically depict the phonology of Mandarin. What it depicts is a northern type of Mandarin that had evolved by then. And it's not the same as the Ming period Mandarin of the city of Beijing that I just described. But that language is similar to the Beijing dialect of late Qing China, but it is also different in significant ways. In fact, I argue that the differences between the late Qing and Yuan versions of the dialects of the central Hebei region provide good evidence that the Ming dynasty's southern linguistic infusion had a powerful influence on the linguistic character of Beijing and its environs. The Ming Guanhua was a lingua franca, or koine. In Chinese, we can call a koine tongyu. However, it was not a single specific language with a fully defined grammar and fully standardized pronunciation. It was fluid in form within a set of commonly recognized parameters. This lingua franca would have developed along the model of a dialect or set of base dialects that were considered to be prestigious and economically or socially more weighty or useful. And that's why it was so widely used on the main routes of commerce and travel. The Ming-Qing Guanhua was a lingua franca or koine. So the next slide here. There were two varieties that had evolved during the course of the Yuan through the Ming, two varieties of Mandarin dialect. These varieties were recognized as a northern and southern form, frequently being distinguished as Beiyin and Nanyin respectively. The latter was dominant in the Ming and the early Qing, that is the southern form, and the former gradually gained ground later in the Qing, but did not attain real or full dominance even at the end of the Qing dynasty, although it had briefly served as sort of a standard during the Yuan. Each of these two varieties had its own dialect base. The reason they were distinguished geographically has to do with the history of their dialect bases. The history of that tongyu, or lingua franca, or koine, is intimately related to the history of the dialects, and can be discerned within the dialects themselves in various ways. At the same time, study of the history of the Chinese dialects can also help us understand the Guanhua Koine. In addition to referring to the Mingqing Koines, the word Guanhua now has also been adopted as the name of the dialects presumed to have served as the base dialects of those Koines, or the descendants of those dialects. So we now have the term Guanhua Fangyan. Thus, there are two meanings to distinguish when speaking of Guanhua, the Koines and the dialects. There are a Beiyin and a Nanyin for the Koine because there are two basic types of Mandarin dialect which can be roughly referred to as northern and southern types, but more accurately can be noted to be a younger or newer type, which is the northern form, and an older type, which is the southern form. In Chinese, we can call that a Xinpai Guanhua, which corresponds to Beiyin, and a Laopai Guanhua, which corresponds to Nanyin. The historical roots of Laopai Guanhua dialects, Guanhua dialects, goes back at least as early as the Northern Song. So it's older, that's why we call it Laopai. Or more likely to the origin of the Mandarin dialect type itself in the late Tang. So the southern form is older with the deepest roots in history, while the historical roots of the Xinpai northern Guanhua Fangyan go back to the Zhiqin Jin and the time of the southern Song. So the basic outlines that I'm going to give you of the history of these two types of Mandarin were outlined in sort of initial form by Professor Jerry Norman, these scholars I've listed here. Yeah, but I'll skip over that. I developed this history out of the base and sort of foundation that they developed, but I've gone on with other sort of discoveries and conclusions. So what I want to do in the few minutes I have for the remainder of this talk is to briefly outline in macro perspective the highlights and gist of this history of Mandarin, based principally on Norman, but with some additional thoughts about the key elements of the evolution and flow of the dialect development, particularly with regard to the possibility of the Koines formed on the Mandarin dialects in the various stages of their development. I don't really want to get too technical for you here, but I want you to keep your eyes on just a few key points of development in the dialects as we go through maps, which I will be presenting shortly. I want to focus on a few illustrative language features, primarily the ru tone. That's the tone that in Cantonese ends with PT and K. Its presence or absence and various patterns in its loss is a major point of reference in understanding the different Mandarin varieties. The most fundamental difference between Xinpai and Laopai Guanhua Fangyan and the Koines based upon them is in the presence or absence of the ru tone. Laopai has it and Xinpai does not. The Nanjing dialect fingerprint, which I will illustrate shortly with a chart drawn by Y.R. Zhao, is a feature that is unique to the Nanjing-Hefei corridor dialects, the hometown region of Ming founder Zhu Yuanzhang, who was from what is now Fengyang County in Anhui. Also, I'd like you to focus on the R suffix, probably characteristic of many Mandarin dialects of the Central Plains and of the Koine or Koines of the late Tang and early Song. So I want to center my discussion on a few representative Mandarin dialect types and examples. A Kaifeng Koine that moved to Hangzhou in 1132 during the Southern Song, forming a conservative dialect island that kept characteristic Kaifeng regional features over time, even into the 20th century. Hangzhou served as a key anchor of the Southern Mandarin type together with Nanjing well into the Ming. Hangzhou is richly representative also of the R suffix, which must have had origins that go back to the late Tang in the Central Plains. Then we will look at Yuandadu region, which held a jiaoliao, it's a technical term for a Mandarin dialect type, then followed by the rise of another dialect type called jilu. And subsequently, after the Yuan, the jiaoliao type was squeezed east by the newer jilu type. And we will mention how the jilu type, this later form of variety of Mandarin, was forged through contact with the Ming Nanjing Hefei corridor dialect, or Koine, that had moved north to Beizhili in 1421 with the Ming court. And so, intermingling with the Mandarin that already existed there, you had this new Mandarin Jilu type develop. The Beijing Ru tone fingerprint is something that I list here. This is the way that the Ru tone words were redistributed into the four tones of the Beijing dialect. And it has a specific pattern that is characteristic of the Hebei dialects. It's all invisible now, unless you know what to look for. The travels of the pronunciation of one word, that I'll focus on in this coming slides, will illustrate. That's the word for color or facial expression, which I've put down there. The character is on the slide, but I'm not going to pronounce it yet. So, what I want to do now is briefly map out the flow of Mandarin evolution. I'll try to do this quick, but I hope to keep your attention and not go so quickly that you can't follow. So we're going to use this map here, which shows the current distribution of several Mandarin dialect types. We can use it to explain how the current situation evolved. In the Tang, dialect innovations moved in from the northeast and spread to the west across the central plains towards the Gansu corridor. And soon after these, an early pre-Mandarin northern form probably arose and began to spread into the northwest, across the central plains and into the northwest. So this is sort of the early sprouts of Mandarin, forming in the northeast, spreading down through and across the central plains, and then into the northwest, right along the Silk Road. The dialects spoken in the Luoyang to Chang'an region or corridor would have been the primary set of dialects that underlay the Tang Koine. Tang dynasty probably also had a Koine in the way that Ming and Qing had a Guanhua Koine. This corridor was also the main artery of the Silk Road within China proper. And so perhaps some of the early characteristic features of this early Mandarin would have been forged within this linguistic environment. The dialects spoken in the Luoyang-Chang'an corridor would have been the primary set of dialects that underlay that Koine and what was spoken in the Silk Road. So here, Gao Shi, we have a Yifu Ge, an example of a verse with a Mandarin word in it, ta. This is a very characteristic Mandarin word, and it was new to be used as a pronoun for he, she, him, and her at this time. Gao Shi was a frontier poet, Biansai Shiren. He was from far north in Changzhou of Bohai, Xian, in Hebei. It is likely that this northern pronoun ta had already taken root in the surrounding region in his day and then slowly made its way south and west from there. We can also see the characteristic negative Mandarin of bu here in this example. In Tang times, even Mandarin's precursor would have had a rutone with final PTK endings as found in Cantonese. So this would be the common ancestor between Cantonese and Mandarin. Zhang Hu's family, the author of this piece, was from southern Hebei, but he was probably born near Nanyang in Hebei and spent much of his childhood in Suzhou. And the reason I have this example here is to show that he was a northerner, but he had this root tone in his, which he used to rhyme, and also he had a little bit of mixing of northern and southern forms because the pronunciation of the word loquat is a Suzhou pronunciation that he mixed in with his northern dialect. So Du Fu, a very well-known poet, was born and raised in central Henan near Luoyang and active in Chang'an in his adult years. His poetry is peppered with colloquial words from the newly developing Mandarin. And often earlier scholars would criticize Du Fu's poetry for being sort of tu or gauche in their use of this Mandarin, which they didn't consider to be good form for literary language. So these are just some examples of the word chi, the word bu, the word ge, and the shui are all Mandarin words that Du Fu used in his poetry. In the northern Song, the Mandarin dialect type stretched south from Shanxi and Shanxi across the Central Plains into the direction of Nanjing, and it probably also reached southwest toward Sichuan. So this would have been a language that Su Shi used. We can see it in the changes reflected in the root tone rhyme that he used in his well-known ci, nian nu jiao, chi bi huai gu. The syllables on this ci are root tone syllables, but they've evolved in a way during his life where they could rhyme quite easily in his northern early Mandarin form. And here is sort of my reconstruction, you could say, of his pronunciation. They would all have ended in an A and maybe a glottal stop, and the P, the T and the K endings are merging together. This rhyme only works in this stage. It doesn't work in an earlier stage of Chinese, and it doesn't work in the later Zhongyuan Yinyun stage. So this is a nice illustration of language change in progress during the Northern Song. So Su Shi could probably, let's go back to that a minute, could probably rhyme these because their vowels and endings had evolved in the direction of Northern Song Mandarin. So that's an important point to keep in mind. In the Southern Song, we're moving along through history very quickly, the early contiguous Mandarin, the older form of Mandarin, was split along the Central Plains between Shanxi and the Huai River by a newly evolved Mandarin variety that again swept down from the northeast across the Central Plains with the invasion of the Zhichen Jin. The split resulted in at least two regions with the older Mandarin, the Shanxi area and then the Jianghuai area. The Shanxi dialects now are known as Jin dialects, but they can also be considered to be a subvariety of Mandarin. And then the Jianghuai dialects are generally considered to be a subvariety. There were probably also remnant dialect varieties in the Sichuan area as well, especially later, a large contingent of southern Mandarin migrated in that direction. After the Southern Song established its capital in Hangzhou, bringing the Kaifeng dialect and or the Koine with it, this older Mandarin took on a more southern identity. Hangzhou thus became the far southeastern end of the Silk Road. Traveling that route, Marco Polo may have visited Hangzhou in the late 13th century at the very beginning of the Yuan. Not long after that, a Franciscan friar, Odoric, who visited Hangzhou sometime between 1324 and 1327, was thoroughly awed by the city, which he identified as Qinsai, Kansai, and called the greatest city in the world, which is reproduced. His words are reproduced here on the map in the lower right-hand corner. In French, he wrote it. So now, just as an aside, representing an earlier language stage, 100 kilometers south of Hangzhou, oops, I went the wrong direction. Here are some words from a language that is south of Hangzhou. This would be a possible remnant of an earlier Tang Koine. This is the Yiwu dialect. At the latest, this dialect must have settled in central Zhejiang area in the late Tang or early Song, when the Tang Koine still prevailed. This is seen in its preservation of the old southern R suffix, which has a nasal N. You can look at the Chinese characters and see the R, and then the transcription for that, they all end in N. This is something that was common to the Central Plains dialects in the Tang and the Song, but it only shows up in dialect islands and small pockets where people who had traveled from the Central Plains into the south brought it. It also traveled as far south as Guangxi and Guangdong. But Hangzhou represented a version that is an evolved Song Dynasty form, a true Mandarin form, because it no longer has an N sound. The N sound is gone, all that's left is an R sound. This reflects a feature that must have been characteristic of Old Song Kaifeng dialect and Koine that subsequently traveled south to Hangzhou with the Song court and those who accompanied it. Examples are found in this well-known Mengliang Lu by Wu Zimu. Note that even in this small list, we have a few examples in this small list with the suffix that correspond to words found in the 20th century Hangzhou dialect. The same exact words. These are words that I recorded in the 1980s doing work in Hangzhou. This, you see there's no N, but there's a kind of upside down E with a tail on it. This represents a sound that's like dirt, which is a precursor or a relative to the R in Beijing, but in Hangzhou it's a separate syllable. So the three examples here for knife, daughter, for jujube, they say daughter, daughter, and actually for a small dish, they say ditter, ditter. All of these, they all end in ditter, this kind of sound. This is an early Mandarin type pronunciation. So it's found in Hangzhou, and so this is sort of one way that we can confirm that Hangzhou was an island that had formed there and was a descendant of the Kaifeng dialect from the northern Song. Meanwhile, in the north, the new Mandarin had established itself in the Central Plains. I'm almost done. We should be able to finish most of the important parts soon. And by the Yuan, had evolved into the Jiaoliao type of dialect. So this is what was going on in the Yuan in the north. After they took over the Central Plains, and population that moved in there to the Central Plains after they took over brought a new form of Mandarin, again from the northeast. And this evolved into that type, that subtype that we called Jiaoliao. In the early Ming, this Jiaoliao type dialect existed across a wide territory. And the newer thing that we called Jilu type had not yet developed. The Jiaoliao dialect, or type of dialect, is reflected in the Zhongyuan Yinyun that we mentioned earlier, in a feature that the Zhongyuan Yinyun calls at the lower left page, there's a subheading that says, where I lost my place, that says, 入声做赏声. They're saying that 入声 is the, I have 5 minutes, I'll finish up, that's a characteristic of the Jiaoliao dialect, but it's no longer the case in Beijing except in some exceptions. So this is a fun place to get to. We have this 14th century author, Zhao Yugui, who writes a San Qu that shows the pronunciation of the word that I had pointed out earlier that you should pay attention to rhyme. So in this, we have the rhyming words are lai, tai, pai. And what's the fourth one? Shai, which is the Beijing pronunciation still, but it's been overlaid by a Southern Mandarin pronunciation, sa. And then huai, kai, lai, and mai. So he's definitely revealing his Jiaoliao type dialect. In the Ming, Southern Mandarin traveled north with the Ming court when the capital moved to Beijing in 1421, as noted earlier. This put an overlay of Southern Mandarin and the Southern Mandarin root tones onto the dialects in the Beijing and Hebei region. This dialect context situation resulted in the beginning of the formation of the Jilu dialect type, and the rise of the Jilu type ended up isolating the Jiaoliao type off along the eastern seaside region of the northeast. Also, during the Ming, a series of migrations during the Hongwu reign sent large numbers of speakers from the Jianghuai Mandarin-speaking area to the far southwest, eventually fostering a distinct southwestern Mandarin type. Due to time constraints, I won't be able to talk about the Nanjing footprint, but that's okay. It's a little bit complicated, but it's just a way that we can connect all these various forms of Southern Mandarin together that is very subtle but very clear. And so that's how I can be so confident to say that these three regions' dialects are related in some ways. So, oops. Finally, there's the Ru fingerprint, which is a characteristic of the Beijing dialect. In the Beijing dialect, where the Ru tones words went was irregular, but it formed a pattern that was fixed after a period of time and actually is shared. This pattern is basically shared by the surrounding Hebei dialects. And so that means that the Hebei dialects and the Beijing dialects are sort of sister dialects. And later, these Hebei dialects also moved into the northeast from Hebei and Shandong. And so the Jiaoliao dialects of the earlier period that had spread throughout the region were pushed off to the east. And so I think I've run out of time, so we'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for Professor Simmons' fascinating talk on the sort of prehistory of Mandarin as we now know. So we know that actually there's a northern and southern variety of Mandarin, and also there was once a Mandarin with Rusheng. That sounds more like the Cantonese we know. And also there's various layers of dialectal influences and the connection between the Hangzhou dialect and the Nanjing dialect with Mandarin. Let us open the floor to the audience. So this part is going to be bilingual. 我们也可以就用普通话提出我的发问，那当然用我们标准的普通话，不是官话啊。
Don't.
Or we can try. I cannot speak the historical 官话。 Yes, do we have anyone from the audience? 大家有没有问题可以欢迎大家提问。
Maybe some very ignorant question. Before this, I think you started touching on Tang Dynasty, and it kind of evolved into various sort of sources. I was wondering, the Mandarin that the original source of Mandarin, did it start in the Qingshihua, or is that connection, any source? I mean, and it's probably outside the scope of your talk, but I'm just curious.
Well, I'll try to give you a brief, succinct picture of what happened. Mandarin, as a distinct form of Chinese, has a beginning that we can point to, and it's fairly late, and that is in the Tang Song transition. That era is when the features that define Mandarin showed up. Prior to that, the Mandarin's precursor was just simply an earlier form of the common ancestor to all Chinese dialects. And so Mandarin, certain changes happened in this older form of Chinese, which we call Middle Chinese, which was predominant in the early Tang. A certain set of changes happened that are very characteristic and only happened in Mandarin. And at that point, Mandarin was then a new dialect or a new language. And then it continued to evolve subsequently. And it was that subsequent evolution that is what I was talking about.
So it does have the roots back there in...
Pardon?
So the Mandarin, the current Mandarin...
Yeah, the Mandarin has its roots, go all the way back to the same roots as any other Chinese dialect. But in terms of becoming a distinct form, that happened in the Tang Song period, late Tang and Song.
A quick follow-up on that question, because you did mention about the southern dialect, the southern variety of Guanhua has the feature of Rusheng.
Right.
So in that case, what distinguishes it from the other just dialect with the Rusheng?
Well, what distinguishes it is the fact that aside from, if we don't take the Rusheng into account, other features of that Mandarin, that southern Mandarin dialect, belong to the Mandarin form. So the characteristic word ta that we spoke about, that's only found in Mandarin dialects. It's not found in any southern dialects. And also all words, if you know Putonghua, that are spelled with pinyin R, they developed that pronunciation basically in the Tang Song transition. And those words in southern dialects all became an N at the beginning. So there was a separation where Mandarin took on this R pronunciation and the southern dialects took on an N pronunciation for the same set of words. And that's a widespread thing that happened in Mandarin, and the southern Mandarin dialects had that feature, as well as some other changes that happened.
Wow, thank you. That's fascinating. Do we have another question from the audience? Now, 还有没有其他同学哈啊？这位同学。
首先我要感谢今天这个讲座，让我学到了不少新知识。就是我很好奇的一个点，就是唐朝之前的，就是汉语的形式是怎么复原的，或者是唐朝时期，就是你是怎么能复原出来古人是如何讲话的？
具体如何讲话，我们永远复原不出来。但是我们可以作为一种，就是说叫做构拟以前的语音。这个构拟不是说把它的具体的声音构拟出来，而是把它的大概的一个发音的范围重建。 那么我们这样子就知道过去的这个汉语是大概是什么样的性质的，但是具体的发音你没有办法真正知道，你可以猜。比方说，我认为你如果要说是唐朝的这个最流行的就中原地区的方言，你如果把现在的普通话的声母加上广东话的韵母和声调，你就有一个相当于当时的一种语言的音系，非常有意思。就是官话方言的变化是在元音变得多，在南方的话就是广州这个声母变得多，合并了很多声母。
当然，从那个方法来讲呢，因为我是研究那个印度语言还有佛经的，那佛经翻译里面也有很多那些音译词，我们也可以通过那些音译词了重构过去的发音因为很多比如说菩萨但是过去的发音那梵语是 bodhisattva， 那么我们可以重构菩提萨多过去的古音，因为它应该是比较接近梵语的发音，因为梵语一直没有变化过，但是在汉语一直在变化。那当然，刚才我们也说了，很多那个诗词里面也很多例子，那涉及到一些很复杂的问题，上古音中古音等等的。
还有就是很重要的就是构拟语言的一个工具，就是方言本身。各个方言你互相比较，就像我刚刚说的这个普通话跟广东话做一个比较。你可以得出就是他们本来的这个共同音系的这个前身然后这种书面的材料，范文诗词可以作为这个构拟的补助。
其实我知道史教授是通过方言来重构过去那个发音一个权威，是主要是史教授在汉语研究里面的一个最主要的贡献我们时间都差不多，但是还可以再提出一个问题我看见后面有一位同学
除了当时晋朝有这个五胡乱华，当时这个民族大杂烩这个时期的语言，对现在的官话有没有什么影响？
这个也是我非常希望就知道一个关于那个文化那个不同民族融合的过程中。对官话发展有没有它的一个影响？
肯定是有它的影响，但是具体的影响很难说明。但是比方说这个入声的消失，可能就是因为这个语言的环境、语言接触，就促使它就是慢慢消失。所以后来的北方型的官话没有入声，可能它的开始就是在那种语言的环境里面开始的，还有很多语法方面的一些变化，比方说把字句可能是受他们当时那些不同民族语言的一些影响形成的，还有其他的，但是
因为词汇方面，好像我听说，好像爹娘这些等等都原来不是汉语是吗？
有的对，不是对，有的
像蒙古语之类的。
是，
那好的，那我们非常感谢今天的史教授跟我们的分享。So once again, thank you very much for Professor Simmons for the lecture today. Let us give him a round of applause.
Thank you so much.
Thank you once again, Professor Simmons and Dr. Philman. May I take this opportunity to show our gratitude, and may I invite our head of visible, Dr. Malcolm Fisher, to present the stage our gifts to our guest speaker, Mr. Professor Simmons.
Oh.
Yes, okay.
Take a photo together.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all for joining this afternoon lecture. And we will have a coming lecture on the 14th of November by Professor Lisa Raffles, titled The Invention of the Body in Greece and China. Okay, see you next time. Thank you.